The Currency of Obscurity, Los Angeles, in the early 1970s, was a city completely drunk on its own reflection. It was an era of sprawling neon, sun-baked asphalt, and a relentless, suffocating wave of public attention. If you were someone the world cared about, the city felt less like a home and more like a beautifully lit aquarium. Every move was cataloged, every glance was scrutinized. For the individuals who occupied the absolute stratosphere of global fame, the world had shrunk to the size of a stage. They were trapped in a permanent loop of presentation and perception. True privacy wasn't just expensive, it was practically a myth, an unattainable luxury that no amount of money could outright buy. Yet, tucked away on the sprawling west side of the city, far from the flashing bulbs of Hollywood and the gossiping crowds of Sunset Boulevard, there existed a deliberate exception to this rule. It was a restaurant that defied every single convention of the hospitality industry. It operated completely in the shadows, entirely by design. There were no neon signs buzzing above the entrance. There were no canopies stretching out over the pavement to welcome guests. No valet stands flanked by velvet ropes, and no advertisements placed in local rags. If you happened to walk past its unassuming exterior on a random Tuesday evening, you would see nothing but a plain, unadorned door. It looked like a forgotten storage space, a blank gap in the architecture of the city, or perhaps a private office whose occupant had long since gone home for the night. This absolute lack of branding was its greatest asset. The establishment did not exist to make a profit in the traditional sense. It existed to fulfill a collective psychological need. It was funded, sustained, and fiercely protected by a tiny insular network of people who shared a single, desperate craving: the luxury of being completely invisible. These individuals were household names, cultural icons, and industry titans. They were people whose faces were printed on posters, stamped on vinyl records, and projected onto massive silver screens across the globe. Outside these walls, their presence caused riots, traffic jams, and public spectacles. But inside this room, they were permitted to simply be human. The restaurant stayed afloat because this select clientele decided that its survival was paramount to their own mental well-being. They paid exorbitant prices, not for rare truffles or vintage champagnes, but for the profound privilege of obscurity. The entire operational philosophy of the place hinged on a delicate, unspoken pact of absolute silence. To speak its name to an outsider was to destroy it. If a patron brought an unvetted guest, or if a single detail leaked to a columnist, the magic would instantly evaporate. The venue would be compromised, swarmed by the very public they were trying to escape, and its purpose would be permanently ruined. Therefore, its continued existence relied entirely on a chain of trust that had remained unbroken for over a decade. The people who needed to find it always found it, guided by quiet, face-to-face whispers. The people who didn't need to know were left to walk past it in total ignorance, completely indifferent to the history sitting just inches behind the drywall. Step through that heavy, unmarked door, and the chaotic energy of Los Angeles faded into an almost reverent calm. The interior architecture was intentionally designed to minimize exposure. The layout was a maze of deep booths and small, isolated tables, each tucked away into strategic architectural recesses. The lighting was kept extraordinarily low, not for a romantic ambience, but to create a physical shroud of shadows. It was bright enough to see your plate, but dim enough to render the face at the neighboring table a soft, unrecognizable blur. There were no grand ice buckets, no theatrical tableside carvings, and no aggressive displays of luxury. The menu was minimalist, handwritten every afternoon on a simple piece of cardstock, depending entirely on what fresh ingredients were available that morning. The food was excellent, but it was served without an ounce of ceremony. It was comfort food disguised as high cuisine, designed to satisfy without demanding intellectual engagement or a performance of appreciation. But the most remarkable element of this hidden sanctuary was not the lighting or the food, it was the staff. The waiters, bartenders, and floor managers had not been hired for their encyclopedic knowledge of European vineyards or their ability to recite the complex culinary history of an heirloom vegetable. They were selected for a far more sophisticated psychological discipline, the rare art of unrecognition. In any standard luxury establishment, a waiter is trained to spot a famous face and immediately elevate their service. They offer a wider smile, a more obsequious bow, and a subtle acknowledgement that they are serving royalty. In this restaurant, that behavior was a fireable offense. The staff here possessed the uncanny, highly valuable ability to look directly into the eyes of a global icon and react as if they were looking at an ordinary commuter. It required an immense amount of emotional control. To see a face that had defined a generation and treat it with a flat, polite, completely baseline courtesy was a skill that defied human nature. It was a masterclass in professional indifference. For the regulars, this clinical lack of reverence was incredibly intoxicating. It meant they could drop their shoulders, they could stop managing their posture, they could eat with their mouths open, spill a drop of sauce on their lap, or look tired without worrying that the mistake would end up in a supermarket tabloid the following morning. They were paying for the beautiful, empty space of if nothing happening. On this particular night in 1972, the air inside the dining room was thick with this hard-earned tranquility. The low murmur of quiet conversations floated beneath the soft hum of the ventilation system. Cutlery clicked softly against porcelain. The shadows held their secrets close. It was a Tuesday night like any other, functional and quiet, performing its quiet miracle of safety flawlessly. At the absolute back of the room, seated at a small corner table positioned farthest from the entrance, two men were deeply immersed in a shared bottle of wine. By any external standard, their pairing was a surreal, almost impossible collision of cultural galaxies. One was a scruffy, sharp-tongued musician from Liverpool who had helped reshape the entire landscape of modern music. The other was a compact, fiercely disciplined martial artist from Hong Kong who was single-handedly breaking down Hollywood's racial barriers with his explosive physical philosophy. Outside these walls, if these two men walked down a street together, it would cause a literal emergency. Traffic would halt, police barricades would be erected, and thousands of screaming fans would tear at their clothing. But here, in the deep, protective shadows of the corner table, they were just two tired men in their early 30s, sharing a meal in a city that usually demanded every ounce of their energy. They had been sitting there for nearly 40 minutes, and the evening was delivering exactly what they had paid for, an absolute, beautiful vacuum. No one was staring, no one was approaching them with a napkin to sign. The waiter had set down their dishes with a quiet nod and disappeared back into the darkness without a second glance. For a brief moment in time, the crushing weight of their respective legacies had been lifted. They were experiencing the rarest commodity in the modern world, the profound luxury of an ordinary, unremarkable evening. Section 2. Two forces, one corner table. In the deceptive quiet of that back corner booth, the atmosphere between the two men was remarkably light, devoid of the suffocating gravity that usually followed them everywhere else. John Lennon sat back against the leather cushion, his casual jacket slightly rumpled, his iconic round spectacles catching the faint amber glint of a nearby candle. His long hair fell loosely around his face, a familiar silhouette that usually ignited absolute chaos across Europe and America. But tonight, his features were softened by a genuine ease. Across from him sat Bruce Lee, a man whose physical presence was so intensely calibrated that even in total relaxation, he looked like a loaded spring. He wore simple, unpretentious clothes that gave no hint of the global cinematic storm he was brewing. They had gravitated toward one another not because their artistic mediums were similar, but because they shared a very specific, rare psychological affliction. They both knew exactly what it felt like to be completely consumed by an identity they had created. When you reach the absolute pinnacle of global recognition, a strange, toxic split occurs within your life. There's the actual human being, fleshy, flawed, prone to fatigue and doubt, and then there is the monument. The public doesn't want the human, they want the monument. They want the myth to perform on cue, to speak in memorable epigrams, to embody the chords or the fight choreography that made them famous. For Lennon, the world demanded a permanent mixture of the witty, cynical Beatle and the ethereal, world-saving peace prophet. For Lee, The world demanded an invincible warrior who could defeat any opponent with a philosophical smirk and a lightning-fast kick. Living inside those expectations was an exhaustive, full-time chore of identity management. It required a constant, low-level expenditure of nervous energy just to step outside a hotel room door. But at this table, the performance had been entirely suspended. As they talked, there was a complete absence of the nervous social posturing that usually corrupts conversations between high-profile individuals. Neither man was trying to impress the other. Neither was checking to see if their statements were landing with maximum dramatic effect. They spoke in the flat, raw, and comforting tones of two tradesmen discussing the peculiar hazards of an incredibly bizarre industry. John Lennon was laughing, a sharp, unforced sound that bubbled up from a place of genuine amusement. It was the specific kind of laugh that belongs exclusively to someone who hasn't had to perform a chuckle for a camera or a corporate executive in weeks. He found a strange, comforting irony in Lee's worldview. Bruce didn't talk like the typical Hollywood elite who frequented the West Side. He didn't use the fluffy, validation-seeking language of producers and agents. He spoke about his craft with a cold, almost mathematical precision, treating physical movement and artistic expression as branches of the exact same evolutionary tree. Lee watched Lennon laugh with a warm, measured expression. He possessed a stillness that was deeply disarming to people who only knew him through the kinetic violence of his films. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around the room to see who might be watching them. His focus was entirely anchored to the square foot of space between them on the table. When Bruce spoke, his words were simple, stripped of the grandiosity that public relations specialists usually plastered onto his image. He meant exactly what he said, no more and no less. If he paid Lennon a compliment, it wasn't flattery, it was an objective observation. If he disagreed with a point Lennon made about American culture, he stated it plainly, without the defensive hedging that most people used when contradicting a living legend. This transparency was the precise reason they found each other's company so therapeutic. In their normal lives, they were surrounded by a vast, parasitic ecosystem of handlers, assistants, managers, and sycophants. They lived in an environment where every piece of feedback was filtered through a lens of self-interest. People agreed with them because their livelihoods depended on that agreement. Honesty was the first thing that fame eradicated. To sit across from someone who lacked that exhausting agenda, someone who was completely secure in their own mastery, was like finding an oasis in a desert of mirrors. They recognized in each other the rare quality of being the thing itself. They were authentic forces of nature, existing independently of the apparatus that marketed them to the masses. As the evening deepened, their conversation wandered through the complex psychological architecture of their lives. They spoke at length about the strange, isolating reality of being recognized everywhere while simultaneously belonging nowhere. Lennon described the surreal experience of looking out at a stadium filled with 50,000 screaming human beings and feeling a sense of absolute, profound loneliness. The crowd wasn't connecting with him. They were projecting their own desires, frustrations, and fantasies onto a distant shape under a spotlight. He explained how that level of adoration forces a person to retreat inward, building thick, impenetrable walls around their real self until they start to forget who they were before the world took ownership of their name. Lee nodded in deep comprehension, his eyes reflecting the dark amber of the room. He viewed the problem through the lens of combat and philosophy. He explained to Lennon that the moment a man becomes attached to a specific image of himself, he becomes rigid. And in rigidity, there is death. He spoke about his belief that an artist must always remain fluid, adapting to the immediate reality of the moment rather than trying to preserve a static reputation. He used his hands to illustrate the concept, his fingers moving through the dim air with a smooth, effortless grace that looked like water flowing over stone. He told Lennon that the public's obsession with their past work was a form of trap, a golden cage designed to keep them from evolving into whatever they needed to become next. They talked about the immense financial and emotional cost of trying to purchase a private life. They laughed at the absurdity of the security measures they had to employ just to take a walk in a park or buy a book without causing a public disturbance. It was a bizarre existence where freedom had to be rented by the hour, in hidden backrooms of obscure restaurants, protected by an unspoken code of secrecy among strangers. Yet, Despite the underlying frustration of their circumstances, there was no bitterness in their voices. They weren't complaining, they were simply auditing the ledger of their choices. They both understood that the extraordinary gifts they had received from their careers came with an equally extraordinary tax on their humanity. Outside their small sanctuary, the vast concrete expanse of Los Angeles continued its indifferent, mechanical crawl into the night. The city didn't care about the two creative titans sitting in the corner booth. The headlights on the freeway cut through the smog, the neon signs of the late-night diners flickered, and millions of ordinary lives moved along their own trajectories, completely unaware that a piece of cultural history was quietly unfolding over a half-empty bottle of wine. This indifference was beautiful to them. It was a temporary reprieve from the crushing weight of significance. For 40 minutes, they had successfully tricked the world into letting them be normal. They were just two friends passing the time, enjoying the simple, unvarnished pleasure of a conversation that didn't need to be recorded, broadcast, or justified to anyone but themselves. The heavy wood and iron door of the restaurant didn't slam. It groaned. It was a dense, atmospheric sound that cut clean through the low, rhythmic hum of clinking porcelain and hushed murmurs. In an environment where anonymity was the primary currency, any sudden influx of raw, unfiltered energy was felt instantly, like a drop of cold ink falling into a glass of clear water. The room didn't tilt, but it subtly reorganized itself. Through the threshold stepped a man who didn't understand the geography of silence. He was large in the specific overbearing way that some men are large, not merely a calculation of vertical inches and skeletal density, but an issue of displacement. He stood roughly 6 feet 3 inches tall, weighing somewhere in the neighborhood of 240 pounds, wrapped in a heavy leather jacket that crinkled loudly with every movement. He didn't just walk into the room, he claimed it. He possessed the careless, unearned ease of a person who has spent his entire adult life watching smaller people step off the sidewalk to let him pass. For him, the physical world was a series of accommodating spaces, and he moved through this hidden sanctuary with a heavy, clumsy arrogance that felt entirely foreign to the room's delicate ecosystem. He wasn't falling down drunk, but he had reached that specific volatile state where alcohol serves as a solvent for ordinary human restraint. The thin, necessary social barriers that dictate how closely one person may approach another had become completely permeable. In his mind, the world had transformed from a place of boundaries into a menu of options. His eyes, glassy and unblinking, began a slow, mechanical sweep of the dim dining room. He wasn't looking for a table, he was hunting for a focal point. He was looking for something to justify his presence in a room he clearly didn't belong in. Then, his gaze hit the far corner table, and the scanning stopped. His eyes locked onto the unmistakable silhouette of John Lennon, the round spectacles, the sharp nose, the long hair catching the edge of a candle flame. In that exact instant, the large man made his first mistake. He looked right past the other man at the table. To him, the compact, quiet Chinese man sitting opposite the rock star was completely invisible. He saw simple clothes, a slight frame, and a lack of immediate, flashy consequence. He classified Bruce Lee as an extra in the movie of his own evening, a non-entity, a piece of background furniture that required zero consideration. He didn't look at the way Lee's shoulders were set, or how his weight was perfectly centered over his hips. He saw only what his limited, aggressive world view allowed him to see, a small target and a big prize. The second mistake was already in motion as he began his long, heavy-footed march across the dining room. He walked with the swagger of someone who believed that his intense admiration for a celebrity somehow granted him ownership of that celebrity's time. He had completely confused the act of buying an album with the right to disrupt a human being's dinner. As his large shadow fell over the small corner table, the air in the immediate vicinity dropped several degrees in temperature. John Lennon saw him coming. The change in the musician's face was microscopic, but devastatingly familiar to anyone who lived in the public eye. It was a sudden, flat glaze of absolute exhaustion, the look of a man pulling down an emotional iron shutter. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, anciently tired. He had played this scene 10,000 times before in 10,000 different cities, and it always ended the same way. An awkward, draining transaction where he had to trade a piece of his dignity just to make a stranger go away. But Bruce Lee didn't look down, and he didn't look away. His dark, deep-set eyes tracked the large man's approach with the calm, analytical detachment of a radar system logging a predictable trajectory. He didn't shift his posture. He didn't ball his fists. He simply filed the information into that quiet, instinctive space where his martial discipline lived, and he waited. This wasn't passivity. It was the ultimate expression of readiness. He allowed the situation to develop without trying to force it, watching the large man with a terrifyingly still curiosity. The man arrived at the table and immediately began to speak. His voice was too loud, too thick with self-congratulation, completely shattering the protective silence of the back room. He wanted a photograph. He wanted an autograph. He wanted Lennon to validate his existence right there, in front of the adjacent tables. "No, mate, not tonight," Lennon said softly. His voice carried the flat, practiced rhythm of a refusal that had been engineered to be as unoffensive and final as possible. "We're just having some dinner. Please." But the large man didn't hear the word no. People like him never do. To him, no wasn't a boundary. It was a negotiation tactic. It was just a minor hurdle to be overridden by more persistence, more volume, and more mass. He leaned in closer, his heavy leather jacket smelling of stale whiskey and cold Los Angeles wind. He asked again, his tone shifting subtly from adulation to an ugly, entitled demand. He couldn't comprehend that his desire was not the most important thing in the room. And then, the clock ran out. The third mistake arrived exactly 4 minutes after the man had crossed the threshold. Frustrated by Lennon's quiet refusals, the large man's arm moved. It was a patronizing, aggressive gesture disguised as a locker room camaraderie. His massive, heavy hand came down and landed squarely on top of John Lennon's head, ruffling his hair with a rough, controlling familiarity. The restaurant didn't just go quiet. It froze. The silence that followed that gesture was different from any silence that had existed in the room for 11 years. It was the heavy, breathless pause that occurs between the lightning flash and the thunderclap. The couple at the adjacent table stopped their forks halfway to their mouths. The waiter, standing 4 feet away with a bottle of wine, went completely rigid. The large man was still smiling, totally oblivious to the fact that he had just crossed a line from which there was no possible return. He stood there with his hand resting on the head of a global icon, entirely unaware of the sudden, predatory shift in the atmosphere beneath him. He had looked at the room, assessed his own size, and concluded that he was the most dangerous thing in space. It was the last incorrect conclusion he would ever be allowed to make in that restaurant. Section 4. 7 seconds of perfect clarity. The touch was a violation of the most fundamental kind. It wasn't an act of physical violence, not yet, but it was an absolute execution of dominance, a heavy, patronizing palm pressing down on another human being's skull. John Lennon's body went completely static under the weight of that hand. His eyes stared straight ahead at the candle flame, his jaw locked in a tight, pale line. He looked like a man preparing to endure a storm he could not stop. But across the small table, the landscape had already shifted. Bruce Lee's gaze left Lennon's face and focused entirely on the large man's wrist. What happened in those dark eyes was a transformation that witnesses would talk about for decades, though none could ever settle on the exact word to describe it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't theatrical rage. It was a cold, frighteningly sudden transition from absolute stillness to absolute utility. The philosopher had stepped aside. The mechanic had arrived. Then came the sound. It was the most deliberate, terrifyingly clear noise in the room, the sound of a fork being set down. Bruce didn't drop it. He didn't slam it. He placed it onto the rim of his porcelain plate with a controlled, rhythmic precision. It made a sharp, metallic clink that seemed to echo in the dead silence of the back room. To the patrons at the 3 closest tables, that sound was an announcement. It carried the specific weight of a closing door. It communicated, with total and final clarity, that the conversational phase of the evening had officially ended. In one fluid, unbroken motion, Bruce Lee stood up. To the people watching, the act of him rising from his chair didn't look like normal human movement. There was no preparatory shifting of weight, no awkward clearing of the table legs, no grunt of physical exertion. It was a masterpiece of pure kinetic economy. His body simply ascended, moving from a seated position to a full stance with the effortless grace of a shadow moving up a wall. He stepped around the corner of the small table. 3 steps. No noise. His shoes didn't make a single sound against the floorboards. He stopped directly in front of the 240-pound intruder. The physical contrast between them was absurd. The large man looked like a mountain of leather and dense muscle. Bruce looked compact, almost delicate by comparison, dressed in simple clothes that hid the terrifying density of his physical conditioning. He had to look up to meet the man's eyes, but his posture carried absolutely zero deference. Bruce spoke one sentence. For the rest of their lives, the people in that room would argue about what that sentence was. The waiter swore he heard, "Take your hand off him." The couple at the next table claimed it was, "You need to step away from this table right now." Lennon would later hint that it was something much simpler, almost polite. But the exact syntax didn't matter, because the sentence wasn't a request. It was an exit ramp disguised as a statement, the very last moment for the large man to salvage his own safety. The man looked down at Bruce, blinked his glassy eyes, and did the worst thing he could possibly do. He laughed.